Welcome everyone to our Where Are They Now video series. In observation of our 20th anniversary, we are sitting down with past seed grantee founders and catching up on their accomplishments and activities since receiving the grant. I'm your host, Tom Rue, and today, I'm joined by a legend in the ecosystem. I am joined by Karl Rectanus, founder of LearnPlatform, which then was acquired, I believe, in 2022
That's
by,
right.
by Instructure, which for those of you who don't know the edtech space, they are the OG of learning management system, Canvas. And I think Learn Platform was it founded in 2014?
2014. That's right.
2014. And so the year you founded, you got a seed grant, if memory serves, in 2014.
Yeah, that's right. But for the NC IDEA program and that seed grant, we would not have gotten to the next level, and the next level after that, and the next level after that. So the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and NC IDEA was critical for us in doing that.
I appreciate you sharing that, Karl, because, they say successes have many parents, but the failures die as orphans.
Yeah.
And in our space, when I mean our space, I mean the economic development space where entrepreneurial support organizations like ours exist, we take a little bit of more parental credit because typically we are that very first tranche of external funding,
Yeah.
right? You've squeezed whatever you can from Uncle Jim and Aunt Susan, right? You've rated your 401k as much as you're willing to go and still stay married. Um, it's that first checkpoint where it's like, okay, somebody outside of my cone of safety has said, yeah, there's potential here and we're willing to put some money there.
Tom, not only that, which it absolutely was, and you should take that credit, but the process, we hear all the time that, the outcome's important, but the journey is what builds you. And frankly, the process of applying and refining was external validation that I thought was really important for us to move to the next level too. So obviously, we were excited to be successful in the seed fund to receive a seed grant, and what's better than non-dilutive cash to go work on something you care deeply about. But just the process of doing that, I think, set us up for ongoing success moving forward too.
Yeah, free money is good. I have yet to run into the person that doesn't have or has an issue with free money, and I appreciate you saying that because you're absolutely right. For the people that get the most out of this, and I think this is one of those kind of life lessons, quite candidly, right? You get out of life what you put into it. It's one of the reasons why everything that I've read and listened about your life is so inspired. And we're going to get into that a little bit if you're comfortable with that, like
Of course, glad to
teaching
be.
English in Japan and following a love interest down to Australia. I really enjoyed one part where I heard you saying that you couldn't legally get a job, so you started a company, right? That's a beautiful hack, life hack. But if we can come back a little bit to the origin, and I've been asking in these series because it does predate me. I started March 1st of 2016, so I came on the scene, about 2 years after you got your seed grant.
Yep.
I'm curious in those earlier days, like how did you plug into NC Idea? How did you find NC Idea? Was it just something you stumbled on, or were you connected to Dave and John and Lister, or like, what was that
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. Just for context, I grew up here in North Carolina for the most part. As you mentioned, left, went overseas, lived in Japan, Australia, DC, California, had landed back in North Carolina in late 2007, 2008. Um, and, as I had re-entered into this area with a little bit of entrepreneurial experience outside the state, um, initially it was Fred Hutchison, the OG, who,
OG
back
of
in the day,
OGs.
yeah, I mean, he quite literally, I can tell you where I was, and it was a BlackBerry because he just said, "Hey, call this guy, tell this person I told you to, connect CED." At the time it was Monica, and it was and it was Chris, and it was all these different people. And so fast forward to 2013, 12, 13, I had been doing due diligence for an idea that just would not fall out of my head. I could not, I had that itch, that happens to those of us with this entrepreneurial disease. Couldn't shake it. Spent about a year trying to find a company to start this because I had 3 kids under 5. I was an old guy at 30, my late 30s, and quote unquote an old guy, and was running a very successful consulting organization. But this was sort of stuck in my head. And so as I did due diligence, a couple things happened. One, I pressure tested that idea with a number of folks, including John Cambier and Lister, including Chris Hively, including John Austin, as well as others. And I think it might have been John, and at the time, John Austin, I think, was engaged too, who said,
Groundwork Labs.
there's, this might be interesting. We're not really education people, in terms of investors, but while you refine it, there's this program called NC IDEA, um, and it's non-dilutive and it's a grant program. And I was like, you don't want to be on the cap table? I said, no, we actually might want to be on the cap table, but there's, it's free money. And as you said, free money is pretty rare. It's rare enough to ask, like, what's the deal? Like, where are the strings attached? Um, and so got connected through the great ecosystem here. And I think it was a combination of other entrepreneurs and groups like what Chris Hively and Dave were running at the time, CED and others, and Idea Fund partners, I think, that referred us over.
Yeah. And Chris and Dave had Startup Factory.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and then,
Joystick Labs and then Startup. I couldn't remember what it was called at the time. Yeah.
yeah, believe it or not, I think we just this year, like a couple months ago, I think Joystick Labs finally closed. We did the last
Okay.
distribution and, put
Hey,
that to bed to rest.
some gifts
But
keep giving.
that they do, and it's interesting with the context, historical context, because things were different back then, right?
Yeah.
I even look at our field right now. A lot of people back in the day, which would coincide with the founding of NCID, it was the heyday of what we refer to as TBED, technology-based economic development, right? And it had this formula that different parts of the country try to replicate, usually surrounded by some academic density,
Yeah.
which here in the Triangle, we have these 3 little institutions and a few others, to be candid,
Yeah.
that give us kind of a nice core of IP being cranked out. Let me pause there for a second. The genesis, though, of your work with LearnPlatform, was there any university IP, or were you inspired through anything in your academic journey?
I worked in education, both as an educator and then
Right.
an administrator for schools, and learned a lot about how the system worked and didn't work for students and teachers. And so Learn solved a number of problems that I had felt even in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it was meant to address those. So there was certainly academic connectivity. But one of the things that gave us an unfair advantage, I felt like, and why we decided to build the organization here was, RTP has more PhDs per capita than anywhere in the country. Great talent pool, high quality of life, low cost of living, great recruiting. And actually, we were a research-based organization. We really boiled out of, we created some of our own intellectual property, but we recruited quite heavily actually from NC State's education innovation arm at the Friday Institute. Our founding researcher, Dr. Daniel Stanhope, came out of FI at NC State. We worked closely with the State Department of Public Instruction as well as higher ed. And there's actually, you might not realize it, but there's actually a fair amount of education innovation going on here in the Triangle. Fast forward a few years later, we started the EdTech meetup in 2016. We initiated it and said, "Hey, we'll host this for the first 6 months, but if there's not enough wherewithal for others to take it on and help grow it, then we'll know that, we're not ready for it." And that first meeting had 30 people. I can gladly say we're now in 2025, almost 10 years later. There's 1,000 folks on the roll at the
Wow.
EdTech meetup. It's continued to expand and grow. And so there's a lot of organizations, research, and evidence work going on here, as well as education technology has expanded and matured quite a bit.
I really appreciate you making that point because I think it probably is underappreciated with all the other competing,
Yeah.
categories we have and sectors. And, at the basic human flourishing level, right? Ed tech solutions. I mean, it's what we're going to need if we're going to have, a future worth living. So it's kind of, I don't know, kind of like charge my batteries a little bit to hear you say that we've got that cluster here.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, your point on the basic building blocks of human flourishing are grounded in education and how we expand and grow our knowledge base, how we level up our skills, capabilities, how we drive well-being. Education technology is at the core. And just to take it back in around 2013, 2014, the question was, should we edtech? Right? K-12 and higher ed was arguing if technology should be allowed in schools. And
Oh, isn't that something?
you, that's where we were, right? And
Wow.
so, for a tech-based economy, a tech-based sector, we knew that technology was coming. But at the time, a lot of the market, especially in education, was either bragging that some or one of their schools was one-to-one, had some laptops for kids, or would started with iPads. Um, and fast forward, we're in a very different space. Obviously, a lot has happened, but that's really where we were in 2013, 14 when we launched Learn. Was should we edtech? And my experience and the work leveraging this ecosystem and the connectivity of the work that I'd done in the past really built on another industry that was quite large here, pharmaceutical trials. Um, what Learn Platform, really our initial pitch was, we help you figure out which ed tech you're using that works. And the underlying rapid cycle evaluation technology that we built and innovated and really created a category around was based on pharmaceutical trials, was based on, in pharmaceutical trials, we don't just throw some medicine into a bunch of sick people and say, if it doesn't work, we'll fix it next quarter,
Right.
which is sort of what we do with software. That was the lean model, right? Lean,
Yep.
build, measure, iterate. Well, we use phase one trials, and then, once we get out of the bench science and into phase one, we move to phase two, where we're studying side effects. By the way, this is where some medicines change from being, blood pressure to little blue pills or what have you. Um, and then phase three at scale, and then phase four in market trials. And in education, we have, we had people who were testing stuff, or pilots and teachers that were trying things. And we had randomized control trials, which took, years, were quite expensive, but nobody was really harnessing or capturing anything, any of those things or anything in between. And so, actually, in working with some innovators, including, let's see, Jeff Williams, who was a CRO entrepreneur, did a digital CRO here, another entrepreneur here. We sort of built this model that was looked very much like phase one, phase two, phase three, and phase four, that had increasing rigor. And now, if you look at the US Department of Education's evidence models, they highlight four levels of evidence, starting with promising, or defining, and then promising, moderate, and strong, which look amazingly like, this sort of building rigor and evidence. And we sort of led that based on other analogous, expertise that was here in the triangle.
I going into this call, I do my homework and my prep, and your reputation precedes you, and I knew you were a smart guy, but you've just went another notch up. Like I had no idea you took this, the the medical pharmaceutical model and applied it. And whenever I hear a story of an entrepreneur doing that, and we've had a couple, that are kind of alumni of your own that have done that similarly, and you just look at that and go, "Oh, that's brilliant." That's one of those things that like you sit there and go, "Why didn't I think of that?" Right? To take this model that worked. But I can imagine because you defined a category, I would imagine, I know in some of your earliest days, like you kind of led in with the platform, but it was really the fact that you were giving insight to these systems on like all the learning platforms they were using, which they had no clue. And you're like, "Hey, I want you to pay attention to my product." And they're like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, but you're telling us things we don't know about ourselves, right?" And I would imagine as a past CFO and having worked in public schools, private schools, and nonprofit space, I think that's probably where you had another unfair advantage, to use that expression, where you could kind of, we're about the same age, so I'm gonna hope that this Neo reference from The Matrix applies, right? Like you could see the Matrix for what it was, where others could not. And that could even be like administrators that have been in the profession for like 20, 30 years.
It's really hard to see, the outside label when you're inside, right?
Fair
And when
enough.
you're inside the bottle. And so, um, one of the opportunities I feel very blessed to have had was to work both inside, outside, and through the system to think about how do you effectively scale systemically, how do you scale the stuff that's working best? And that was what we set out to do. And, like I said, our pitch was we help you figure out what you're using that works in education technology. And the response was, hey, can you just tell us what we're using first? Because we can't even tell that yet. And we said, yeah, yeah, it does that. But it's also going to tell you if it's helping third graders, if it's helping your English language learners succeed, if it's helping your teachers move in the directions that you want to. And they said, great, could you just tell us what we're using first? And we realized we had a much larger opportunity, actually, that there was value to the sort of base level information that we could provide for the market, but it would also help educate the market. And our logic was that once you know what you're using, you will then ask if it's working. And that's really, it shifted for us actually in early 2015, where we said, okay, we started as Learn. In fact, I think if you look at our initial application, I think we were either called Learn or Learn Trials.
Yeah, I think it was Learn Trials.
Yeah, so pharmaceutical trials in learning, right? That's the application of this. And but what we realized was there was a much larger opportunity that these folks were not asking if the stuff was working. The first question they were asking is like, where is it all? Could we just, what are we using? And then when we gave them a framework to then evaluate if it was working for, if they were using it, if it was working for their cost basis, if it was working for specific situations, for whom and in what conditions, when we could answer that question, um, it changed the way they approached the work. And so, um, the hard part early on is you spend a lot of time educating the market, but you're constantly learning from them as well where they
Yeah.
are. You have to meet them where they are. So we shifted very early on. We started providing what was net new data on how much of these tools were being used, how often. And as that sort of twisted the knife, both on usage and on effectiveness of those tools, which, you got to be smart about how you approach and grow.
As I'm hearing you tell that, I'm sitting here wondering to myself, is it any wonder that you were wildly successful when you were basically selling the gift of vision? You were helping them see within their own organization their processes. And so, like, of course, right, you're going to be a trusted partner. Yeah, you have to go through the educational cycle, but when you help them get to that light at the end of the tunnel, and now they're going to see the whole landscape for what it is and imagine new possibilities. Who's going to be a better trusted, leader, partner, vendor, right, than you?
Well, Tom, that's certainly in the vision of retrospection. It feels simple. The human body doesn't remember pain, um, and it's kind of you but at the same time, a net new category, didn't have a budget line item, telling them information they may not like hearing, building uh, in a laggard market. Education is traditionally considered, not the most innovative.
Right.
How do we think about and approach that work? And what was important to us early on was having a set of core values and sort of honing in and leveraging what the ultimate impact we wanted to have, which was providing data at the speed of decision making and doing that aligned with our core values. And one of those was we build trust. And there's only one way to build trust. We set expectations and then go meet or exceed those expectations. And so we really leaned on that quite heavily with customers. We didn't overpromise, which was, I would say standard practice in
Oh
the,
yeah, you know it is. Fake it till you make it.
2015, right? We were clear about what we could do, what we would be able to do, but weren't doing yet, and that they had a say in how we progressed. And so by sort of setting those expectations and then going and meeting and exceeding them, you build trust and you build a bank of confidence and believers. And over time, you get to continue to innovate. And were there missteps? Of course. I mean, my standard line was, "We have not completely screwed this up yet." And we didn't. But you bank some of that trust and you say, "Oh, we tried to innovate. Seems like it didn't work. Let's rejigger and figure out the path forward." And so we built our own confidence and conviction using a set of tools and approaches that I've now come to deeply believe in. But it's hard to say that it was guaranteed. Back in the day.
I mean, what in life is guaranteed, right?
Exactly.
Now, you didn't use the C word, but you said, lead with core values. And to me, that's a big foundation of culture, right? The culture of the organization. And I listened to a couple snippets from you in different podcasts and
Mm,
videos you've done. And in one of them, I recall you saying when you were thinking about how you were taking on funding, right? And raise what you have a lot of nice little pearls of wisdom. So, and
mm,
one of the things we'd like to do in these is have, hopefully they're good calories, nutritional value to
yeah.
nascent founders here in this. And one of the ones you said was, raise what you need and not necessarily what you can. And that speaks to dilution. And I'll let you talk about that in a second, but I want to get back to, the fact that when you were talking to potential funders, you were asking like, what diversity do you have,
Uh,
amongst the LPs and things like that? That is living your values. And in these particular times,
yeah.
that's under challenge right now. And some organizations and individuals are feeling bullied, from
Yeah.
living their values. And that goes to, again, the broader culture conversation. And that's an area where we share in those values because we too have kept our North Star throughout this. And whereas you are exhibit A of what the first 10 years of funding was for the organization, a white guy from the Triangle with an idea that, well, it
Yeah.
wasn't ed tech, but it was probably B2B SaaS,
Yeah.
right? To do whatever. The last 10 years, we've taken that funding model. It was 90%, Karl, to now it's 70% female, minority, and rural.
I love it.
And we've done that without, we don't put the thumb on the scale for every Karl that
Yeah.
applies and say, oh, sorry, what we've done is we've invested millions of dollars and hundreds of grants in the ecosystem around the state to level the playing field and to plus up people that didn't have the networks, the access, the experience that you had, the people that didn't have somebody saying, somebody that wasn't in Fred, Hutchinson's, BlackBerry.
Yeah.
And so if we do that and we bring everybody up to the same level, then you can sit back like an organization like us and say, hey, it's a fair fight. You apply like anybody else and let the most competitive applications win. And when you do that, you see a nice evening out. But it took, in our case, we're like on year 10.
Well, and not only that, but our region, um, this is a pretty nuanced point of clarity. But as I get to co-chair the board of CD, the Center for Entrepreneurial Development now, and when you dig into the data, our region and our state has uh, the most diverse in terms of different sectors represented, um, uh, expertise, values, investments, as opposed to a Minneapolis or a Boston where you're going to see heavy, biotech or all med devices, or what have you. Our region has such a diverse set of sectors and expertise, and as you mentioned, academic success, and I mean, just you name it. And so not only is it absolutely clear that NC IDEA is living its impact centered approach and is doing this, but it's perfectly aligned with what has made North Carolina great, right? I mean, it's actually playing to our strengths as opposed to paying attention to the competition and trying to be the valley or what have
Right.
you. And so that's what I think is really important for where we go from here. And really the work that you've done as a leader and as NC IDEA has provided is to equip and engage. And I hope groups like CED and others are also leveraging that type of diverse approach, because fundamentally it's going to drive a stronger economy and better outcomes for everybody.
Karl, just between us, I never understood. I mean, I do. I'm being slightly snarky and a little bit cynical when I say never understand why this isn't an easier sell. It's so I can give you, we could sit on this call for 3 hours and I can tell you all the right reasons, like to, just have it diverse, involved, fully engaged, but it's also smart. So, like, if you don't want to buy the fact that it's like the right thing to do, data overwhelmingly tells you it's the smart thing to do. But take, for example, the hot button issue right now of immigration. I was 7 years at the Kauffman Foundation. As a matter of
Yeah,
fact, um, we snagged Monica Doss while I was there and
great.
grabbed her from CED, brought her over to Kansas City. And so our research department back then had reams and reams of data that immigrant talent coming to the US, there is no economic statistic that's negative. They're 2.5 times more entrepreneurial. They'll start companies at a higher rate. They contribute, to the economy at a level that is just exceedingly better than any other particular demographic. I remember the CEO that hired me at Kauffman said that was so inspired by the data, that the research that they had done. They said if you wanted to really impact in a very positive way GDP in the United States, you would take every foreign student at every business school in the country and staple a green card to their diploma, right?
Yeah,
Because it's the best and brightest. We're attracting them here. And what are they doing? They're starting and they're growing companies and they're creating new things, right? And then go beyond that, like, so go into, racial boundaries and geographic boundaries, right? It's not that there's people with lesser entrepreneurial ambition living in rural communities. I will tell you, people in rural communities are some of the most entrepreneurial, smart, practical people on the planet. They just don't have the density, so the numbers don't reflect, and it just doesn't play into a narrative that has to compete with that kind of Silicon Valley model and narrative.
yeah. I think I say this all the time. So I get to advise funds, organizations, and policymakers now. And first off, it's common sense. When you look at the data, under resourced, non-traditional founders, women, African American, non-white, they have better returns. Period. They create more jobs. They give more returns. Like, let's just talk the numbers, right? Like, you would be silly. If you're in this just for the numbers, great. Let's talk about that. Ultimately, I talk a lot about it. You can position as equity, diversity, expansion. It's a bigger TAM. You're activating
Yes.
a larger, customer set. Or If you're, a student of Clay Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, you're activating, a disenfranchised or underenfranchised group in rural communities or others that are not franchised. So you might as well activate those. Like it just makes sense.
Yeah.
So yes, there are big, unicorns. There are big time problems, big time challenges that need to be addressed. But to be, one of the things that North Carolina can, I think, recognize is that all of the net new jobs in our state have been started by startups, have been created by startups. In the first 6 to 10 years of their growth, the big companies acquire and they move up and down, but they tend to, flow and have layoffs or what have you. But fundamentally, not unlike other places in the country, job creation, wealth creation has come from this sort of entrepreneurial endeavor. And so, if we want to systematically grow, that's one of the areas that we should be activating, and you guys clearly are.
I mean, we've funded direct. We've helped about 600 companies total. So there was a good number of companies that went through what John Austin used to lead, Groundwork Labs, but
Yeah,
never got funded. And then we have funded directly about 450. Of the 450 we have funded, they have collectively created over 5,000 jobs. They've raised 1.5 and counting in private equity. There's 40, I think we're at 43, 44 exits,
awesome.
counting yours as
Yeah,
one of
yeah,
them. Think about the wealth creation that's made for, well, at least for the funds in the state that had enough sense to invest in companies like yours and others. On and on, the economic impact. And we do it as a private foundation that doesn't receive funding from the state or the feds.
yeah,
How nuts is that? And so let's talk about that for a second, because you and I recently bumped into each other. We were both out of our market. We were up in our nation's capital,
yeah.
participating with I think it was pretty much the entire North Carolina delegation,
That's right.
for a couple days of deep thinking around economic development. And I'm trying not to be snarky and kind of lead your response to this in any way, but I- will let me just ask you. So do you think people like that were in that room, the ones that were talking at us, right?
Mhm.
Do you think they get this?
Um, I have been um, really underwhelmed with leadership, um, regardless of party, sector, stage, or background, over the last 6 months. I think the opportunity, uh, to really, there's a thirst right now for clarity. One of the things that was really important for business and was said again and again at that event, the term that got used quite a bit was predictability. Businesses, organizations, economic development thrive on predictability. And, that is not what is motivating decision making right now.
Nope.
I could argue a lot of things and are motivating everything from presidential graft and grift to fear, of outcomes for personal or even broader impact. I mean, we see political violence, very real fear is motivating things. So I don't know that people do or don't understand it, but they are not prioritizing the type of core value driven leadership that I expect we will start to see over the next 2 to 4 to 6 years. Because if we don't, I think it's going to remain unpredictable, and I think our economic prospects are going to be severely challenged.
Boy, you said that in such a polite and erudite way that I would have been incapable of, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, obviously, but I think you're being kind in the assessment. To me, at some point, it's just for years I just would kind of forgive them, right? Well, it's not in their wheelhouse; they're not paying attention. But there's enough evidence out here now, and enough people like me screaming and you know editorializing on this, like say you just committed, 500 million in tax incentives for the promise of 2,000 jobs, right? Obviously, I'm not going to name names, but there's a leader of a pretty darn significant organization in the state of North Carolina in a very big leadership role that puts out a lot of grants. And I remember speaking to him several years ago, and I explained in the job, you made the mention, all net new jobs, right,
Yeah.
from startup companies. And I shared that, and he had a moment of lucidity where I think it was a thought. He didn't mean to let it pass his lips, but he just said, that makes me wonder if insert our organization name here shouldn't have an entrepreneurship strategy as one of the pillars. Now, of course, I was like, yes, you see the light, but that was years ago, and they haven't yet. And we've made multiple attempts at saying, hey, let's partner. We can carve up a strategy together, and
Yeah.
we'll do all the heavy work, right? Because we have built the systems. We do that. We can take in all these applications, and we can vet them, and we can rack them and stack them and pick who's number one all the way down to who's number 129. And we do the expenditure responsibility. My frustration is I could 3x to 4x our output tomorrow if we had more money. I
I,
could absolutely do that.
well, and
And
I think so much of, and I applaud the conversations and the fact that you're out there helping the sector be educated on this. I think admittedly, groups like CED are trying to help coordinate and engage. I think there's a fair amount of education to be done because not unlike teaching, right? When I'm teaching in the classroom, I got 25 to 35 brains that I'm engaging with. It's full time. It is, you are serving your customers right there. And entrepreneurs are spending all day trying to survive and grow those jobs and do that work. And frankly, when the government, when they feel like, oh, I'm not sure how the government works, and I'm not sure what they could do for us, and like, is this a high benefit or value for us? Like, where so people don't spend time educating and explaining, hey, we could 3x this. If you want more of this, let's double down. Let's drive into what would R&D tax credits look like? What would investor credits out of DAFs look like? What would it look like to be able to do some things that could drive job creation in a meaningful way? I'm all for large organizations moving here. I'm even more for growing those organizations here and making them homegrown. And that's the outcomes of that. In our case, look, I did the math at one point. I think we created 300 above average job years for our employees over the course of 7 years. Paid well above average, 300 North Carolina, about 75 FTE company when we sold, with another 25 in contractors. Of those in the North Carolina side, almost 300 years of family supports, of job creation, of tax givebacks, of employment. And just to be clear, NC Idea and one angel group in North Carolina invested that. I raised money from Austin, Boston, the Valley, Texas, you name it, including great impact investors in Emerson Collective and New Markets Venture Fund, who co-led our Series A. We also got philanthropic dollars from support from others. So we brought in, call it round numbers, about 10 million of out-of-state investment to create those jobs. And so did my largest investors, namely my wife and my 3 daughters, who I refer to as my largest investors, but also those who are on the cap table benefit? Yes, they sure did. But here in our ecosystem at the time, not a lot of competition. I would argue that we've gotten much more professional in the approach. Part of that is because of more competition. But I think we have a little ways to go in terms of professionalizing, improving the investment environment here in North Carolina for early stage entrepreneurs and growth stage entrepreneurs, and engaging public-private, the public-private partnerships, making those things happen in meaningful ways, because I just don't think people know. that that's how that happens.
Yeah.
That's actually a safer bet than a tax credit for a large company. Is I think you get better returns in terms of job creation, tax status, et cetera, wealth generation for your economy with those early stage investments. But we talk about the failure rate, and so that's what gets the bumper sticker. The
Right.
reality is when you dig into the numbers, we are as well served. And I do think we have policymakers, including the mayor of Raleigh, who's former, treasurer, Janet Cowell. We've got folks who are running around this idea of an innovation city or innovation regions, starting to understand what that means and what that could look like for us.
Yes, to all of that. You know, when I think about who has to understand that message and hear that message, we get wrapped a little around the axle. I'm doing a little bit of a confession here. Like, I think we need to continue to do a better storytelling. It's kind of why we're doing these Where Are They Now
Yeah.
series, right? I would say to any policymaker, any person of influence, anybody that's, in a hall of power somewhere, like, look, this is Exhibit A. Karl Rectanus is right here, right? You heard how many jobs he's created. You understand the impact. We've done the data. We had last time we checked out of our funded companies, we just go in and scrape it from PitchBook. The last like $180 million, over 72% of it is out of state.
Yeah.
Out of state. And then I just want to say to everybody, like, and I know there's niche players, so like I'm not trying to overly generalize here, right? So like some of those funds like that may the company they funded in North Carolina might be one of two investments they make all year. So I get that. But there's still a lot of deal making getting done that begs the question, what do these out of state funds see in our companies that we don't see in our own? That's part one of that. And then the second part of that is just it's the sunk cost of the work, right? I'm going to let you in on a secret. And you would know this better than most because you went through the process, right? When you made the cut and got your seed grant back in 2014, you were probably one of, I don't know what the pool was back then. I'm sure it was probably two,
Eight,
3x.
I'm not sure. We had about 8 or 10 winners, I think, in this.
Yeah.
This.
But what I'm saying is that was probably out of like 40 people that applied. We are getting now routinely between 120 to 200 applications per cycle,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So then when we pick, let's say seed, the 6 seed grant winners. So we know
Yeah.
who's ranked number one, number two. The difference between number 6, the last one to get it, and number 7, the first one that doesn't get it, that's subjective.
Yeah.
There's no science around that, right? There's always a cliff, but it's never where we draw the line. And that line is arbitrarily drawn based upon our own limitations of our funding. We are in our 5th year of an overspend. So when COVID hit,
Yeah.
the staff went to the board and said, people are hurting. We got to step up. And what does that mean? In our case, it means spending more than you intend to, because IRS, you got to spend 5, and we've been spending almost 10%. Now that's shrinking our endowment. You can't do that forever,
Yeah.
right? So at some point, we have to say, does somebody want to leverage through us and disperse capital? Because I could 2x the output, but not 2x the overhead because it's a sunk cost. I already
Yeah.
know who's number 7. I know
Yeah.
who's number 8. I know the next 6 companies that earned, deserved, whatever, the grant. It's 5 more contracts to sign and wire transfers to make. That's no big deal. And so my own kind of operational background, going back to my entrepreneurial pedigree days, that drives me nuts because
Yeah.
that's lost productivity, right?
Yeah, well, and I think the model that you have, I mean, you're similar to an equity or a dilutive investor, and that you've got to basically then spend time raising versus distribution, but you're activating that already, and so hopefully organizations, whether it's the government or state or philanthropy or others will recognize, and hopefully I would encourage them, like, and if I was even as an equity investor, like, show me 7 through 10, because I think they've gone through a strong process and are set up for likely success. The challenge that Tom has is he can't reinvest it, my biggest encouragement would be to make this an evergreen fund, to make this something that changes the direction of our state in a meaningful way. And I'll tie it back to something that I'm spending most of my time on, and because I've seen you do this really well, is the way we built Learn was now what I call being an impact centered organization. The hardest part about growing an organization really is synchronizing the 5 core parts, right? And we've talked about different parts: product strategy, business model, financing, operating model, and culture. Each of those is hard. You're going to have challenges. We talked about some product, we talked about culture, but actually, the governor on growth is how you synchronize those 5 things to scale at the same time. And what we did with Learn, the 2 questions I've gotten the most are, how did you do it and what's next? um, and so here's the answer to the both: is we were an impact centered organization. We thought deeply about the impact we wanted to have and how we would make it. And then as leaders and as our leadership team, we helped those 5 areas of the business continue to grow from goals to strategy, strategy to tactics, tactics to learning. We align those in such a way that equipped us to scale effectively. And whether I'm sure you're thoughtful about this. You may or may not be doing this as a model, but what I've now come to learn as I've advised companies and funds and policymakers is that skill is a little bit different. We believe impact is actually a differentiator, is a driver of growth, not an outcome, or in most cases, impact is considered cost. But that is how we harnessed impact to be an accelerant. At CED, we've set out a vision. CED has set out a goal to build $20 billion of enterprise value in the next 10 years. That's going to happen. We're going to do that, not because, I don't say that as, because it was going to happen anyway. I say because I have confidence in the work in this ecosystem that we're going to be able to do it, but also because we're clear on what the impact that we want to have and aligning those things to move it together.
Yeah, no doubt. And obviously, CD is very fortunate to have you in a leadership role there. I thought when I saw the announcement, I was like, wow, that's a genius move,
Well,
and good on them. And thank you.
Well, This is my chance to give back to an ecosystem that has supported us in amazing ways. I'm a volunteer. I co-chair with Scott Euchness, who's just an amazing entrepreneur on the biotech side. Kelly Rowell and the team, really drive that. It's just one of the areas where I get to engage with folks like you and the rest of the ecosystem.
Well, I like to land these always on some really profound wisdom, from the guest. You have just been a fountain of that on this call, so thank you so much for that. Now, if there was a parting piece of advice you would give to, the old Karl, pre-Learn or at the beginning of Learn, what might that be?
Let's see. Well, one, perfect is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
So just go do it. Secondly, true success, you're going to make money and lose money probably. But true success is getting to work with people you actually want to work with and learn from on a problem you really care about. So I just encourage people to try and do that as much as they can. And when they, keep impact at the center of the work that they're doing, the rest of the stuff tends to work out.
It does. It takes care of itself. And I don't know, again, if my younger me knew that when I was struggling through those, but it's something older guys get to say to younger people and say, trust us, we've been there. You may be worrying more than you need to.
Yeah. Well, I think what's comes again and again, and one of the pieces of encouragement, which I appreciate for you, Tom, and we talked a little bit about this, but you know, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. I want to encourage folks to go ahead and be strong, be smart, be thoughtful, but show leadership. The rest of whether it's your market, whether it's your family and friends, whether it's your region or your sector, our country is thirsty for true leadership, for leadership that cares, that sets a direction and helps persuade people that there is a way to get there, and then they show them how to do it. And I think entrepreneurs are uniquely qualified to sort of share in what that leadership should look like. And so I encourage, whether you're just starting your journey or you're an experienced entrepreneur trying to give back, the number one thing people can do is be leaders right now, not wait for somebody else. They should engage as leaders and engage with our ecosystem to go do it.
Karl, you stuck the landing. So I'm not going to spoil it by adding anything to that other than to say thank you so much. And I really look forward to, bumping into you around the ecosystem. And if we can ever be helpful to you or your efforts, please feel free to reach out.
You're doing it. Thank you so much, Tom.
Take care.